My sister accused me of trying to steal her husband. My parents kicked me out without listening. But my grandfather changed his will in secret, and now my family is destroyed by an inheritance they never saw coming. I'm 23 years old, studying psychology at university. And honestly, I need to tell this story, because what happened like a year and a half ago literally destroyed my family. Or well, the family I thought I had. I guess I should start from the beginning, when things still seemed normal, or what I considered normal at that time. I grew up in a house where I always felt like I was the second choice, you know? My sister Nicole was like the perfect daughter, the golden child, as they say now. She got good grades without trying too hard, was popular, always knew what to say and how to behave in front of my parents. I, on the other hand, was quieter, weirder, I guess. I liked reading and spending time alone, and my parents never liked that. My mom always said things like, "Oh, honey, why can't you be more like your sister?" And my dad basically ignored me most of the time unless I had done something wrong. But well, that's how things were, and I had learned to live with it. You know what I mean? It it wasn't the worst family in the world. It was just a bit dysfunctional, like so many others. Nicole got married when I was like 19, just starting university. Her husband Matthew seemed like a good guy at first. He was nice, polite, had a stable job in some finance thing. My parents adored him, obviously, because to them he was the cherry on top of Nicole's perfect life. I interacted with him the normal amount, like hello at family gatherings, small talk about the weather or university, nothing more. The truth is, we never had a close relationship or anything. He was just my sister's husband, and that's it. Looking back now, I should have seen it coming. Matthew was always kind of weird with me, like too friendly sometimes, but I thought he was just trying to be a good brother-in-law, you know? Sometimes he'd text me asking how university was going or if I needed help with anything, and I'd respond because I didn't want to be rude. But I didn't really keep the conversation going either. Nicole never seemed bothered by it. In fact, I think she didn't even know most of the time because she was super busy with her new job. Everything went to shit, literally 2 weeks before my final exams of third year. I was at home in my room studying for a statistics exam I had the next day. It was like 10 at night, and suddenly, I hear my parents coming up the stairs with those heavy steps they make when they're angry. They come into my room without knocking, both with faces I'd never seen before, like a mix of disgust and fury. And my mom just says we need to talk now. I just sat there on the bed, not understanding anything, with my statistics book still in my hands, and my dad throws his phone onto the bed. On the screen was a WhatsApp conversation, supposedly between Matthew and me, where I was telling him super inappropriate things, like sexual insinuations and I don't know what else. I was literally in shock looking at those messages because I had never written that. They didn't even sound like something I would say. I tried to explain to them that those messages weren't mine, that someone had made them up or edited them or I don't know what, but my mom just yelled, "How could you do this to your sister? What kind of person are you?" And my dad didn't even look at me, just shook his head like disappointed. I told them to check my phone, that they'd see there that I had never sent those messages. But my dad said that didn't prove anything, that I could have deleted the conversation or used another phone. Nicole appeared at my bedroom door crying, and when I tried to talk to her, she told me not to come near her, that she couldn't believe I had betrayed my own sister like that. The thing is, I was so confused and scared that I couldn't even form coherent sentences. I just kept repeating that I hadn't done anything, but nobody was listening. My dad gave me like half an hour to pack my most important things and leave the house. Half an hour. Can you believe it? I had final exams in 2 weeks, all my books and study materials were there, my entire life basically, and he was kicking me out like I was a criminal. I called my boyfriend Tyler crying, but he was in another state visiting his family and couldn't come get me. I called a couple of friends, but it was late and nobody answered. I was literally packing my clothes in a suitcase with my hands shaking, trying to decide what was most important to take, when my grandma called me. I don't know how she found out so quickly. I guess Nicole or someone told her, but she told me to go to her house immediately, that she and my grandpa were going to pick me up. My grandparents lived like 40 minutes from my parents' house, in a smaller town where my grandpa had worked his whole life as an accountant before retiring. They had always been good to me, much better than my own parents, truth be told. But it's not like we had a super close relationship because I didn't see them that often. That night, when I got to their house with my suitcase and my university backpack, my grandma hugged me at the door and didn't ask me any questions, just told me to go rest. My grandpa was sitting in the living room, and when I walked by, he told me, Don't worry, sweetie. Nobody here is going to judge you without hearing you out first. The next morning, I sat down with them and told them everything. Showed them my phone. Explained that those messages didn't exist in my conversation with Matthew. That someone had fabricated them. My grandpa, who was a super calm and analytical man from his lifetime of work with numbers and documents, told me that he believed me. That he knew his granddaughters. And knew I wasn't capable of doing something like that. My grandma just nodded and squeezed my hand. It was the first time in like 24 hours that I felt like I could breathe properly. You know? That someone believed me without questioning me. My parents obviously found out I was with my grandparents because I had nowhere else to go. Like 3 days later, my dad showed up at my grandparents' house furious. I was upstairs in the guest room trying to study for my finals from the computer because I couldn't go back home for my books, and I could hear the shouting from downstairs. My dad was telling my grandpa, how dare he give refuge to someone who had tried to destroy her own sister's marriage, and my grandpa responded with that calm voice he had, that while I was under his roof, nobody was going to disrespect me. My dad yelled at him that he should never speak to him again then, that if he chose to believe me over his own son, then he no longer had a family, and he left slamming the door so hard it shook the whole house. The following weeks were like a weird nightmare. I went to my final exams at university feeling like a zombie, unable to concentrate well, with that weight on my chest that my family had abandoned me for something I hadn't done. Tyler came back and supported me a ton. He'd come visit me at my grandparents' house and try to cheer me up, but I felt like disconnected from everything. My grandparents never pressured me to talk or anything, they just let me be. Cooked for me, my grandma would sometimes sit with me while I studied and bring me tea. It was weird because I had never lived with them before, but at the same time it felt more like a home than my parents' house had in a long time. I managed to pass my finals. Not with the grades I would have wanted, but considering everything that was happening, it was fine. I decided to stay the summer with my grandparents because I literally had nowhere else to go, and besides, I got a part-time job at a coffee shop in town so I wouldn't feel like a parasite living off their pension. My grandpa said not to worry about that they were fine financially and they wanted me there, but I needed to do something, keep myself busy, so I wouldn't go crazy thinking about the whole situation. In August, just when I was starting to feel like maybe I could move forward with my life despite everything, my grandpa died. It was super sudden, a heart attack in his sleep. One night he went to bed normal after dinner, and the next morning my grandma couldn't wake him up. I was devastated, because he had basically been my salvation those last few months, the only father figure who had really supported me, and now he was gone. My grandma was destroyed, obviously. They'd been married like 50 years, and I tried to be strong for her, but the truth is we were both falling apart. The funeral was weird and tense. Nicole came but didn't talk to me or look at me, just sat with Matthew on the other side of the church. Some aunts and uncles and cousins were there. Several clearly avoided me because I guess my parents had spread their version of the story. But what hurt most was that my parents didn't even show up. My grandma called my dad to tell him his father had died, and he said he was very sorry about the situation, but he and my mom were out of town and wouldn't be able to attend. Lie. Because later I found out from a cousin that she'd seen them at the town supermarket 2 days before the funeral. They just didn't want to go, because it meant being in the same place as me and admitting that my grandpa had believed and supported me. Like 2 weeks after the funeral, Edward showed up, my grandpa's lawyer, who was also his lifelong friend. He came to the house to read the will, which I thought was just a formality because I assumed my grandpa would have left everything to my grandma like is normal. Edward sat in the living room with my grandma and me. He had this big folder with documents and started explaining the provisions of the will. The house went to my grandma. That was obvious and expected. But then Edward said that all of my grandpa's savings, which was like all the money he'd saved in his life working, he left to me. To me. Not to my parents. Not divided among his children, but everything to me. I was literally paralyzed because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It was a considerable amount of money. I don't know. Enough to pay for the rest of my university, buy a car, have a financial cushion for several years. My grandma just smiled and told me that my grandpa had changed his will right after I moved in with them, that he knew what he was doing and wanted to make sure I was okay no matter what happened. I started crying right there, because I understood that even when he was alive, my grandpa was planning how to protect me, how to give me a chance to be independent from my parents and their toxicity. Edward also mentioned that there was a property in Florida in my grandpa's name, but that it had its own special conditions he would explain later if necessary. At that moment, I didn't pay much attention to it because I was too overwhelmed with everything else. Not even a week passed when my parents showed up at my grandma's house. I was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard the doorbell and familiar voices at the entrance. My mom had that sweet, soft voice she used when she wanted something, telling my grandma that they had been thinking a lot and that maybe they had been too hard on me, that they wanted to give me a chance to come back home and reconcile. My dad was there, nodding and adding that family is most important, and that they had really missed his dad at the funeral, that they regretted not going. It all sounded so fake and rehearsed, it made me want to throw up. My grandma, who is a lady of like 70 years old but has more guts than a lot of young people, told them how convenient that they came to talk about reconciliation right after Edward had read the will. My parents went pale but tried to act offended. Like, how can you think that of us? But my grandma didn't play along. I came out of the kitchen because I couldn't stay hidden, and when my mom saw me, she tried to hug me, saying, "Oh, honey, we've missed you so much." I stepped back and asked her, directly, if they had come for Grandpa's money. The silence that followed was like the confirmation I needed. My dad changed tactics then and said that as my grandpa's son, he had a right to part of the inheritance, that it was ridiculous that they'd left everything to me who was just a granddaughter, and that obviously they were going to talk to a lawyer to fix this. That's when my grandma explained to them exactly what my grandpa had left. The house for her, the savings for me, and the Florida property for them if they insisted on claiming inheritance. My parents got excited about Florida. I think they thought it was like a beach house or something valuable. And my dad said then to activate that part of the will because it was only fair. Edward came again to explain the details of the Florida property to them. Turns out, yes. Technically, it was a property in my grandpa's name, but it came with a massive debt of back taxes, municipal fines, and I don't know how many other things. My grandpa had bought it specifically as a trap for anyone who tried to claim inheritance out of greed. If my parents wanted the property, they'd have to accept all the debt that came with it too, and that debt was like 3 times the value of the savings they'd left me. It was basically a financial bomb designed to explode in the face of anyone who claimed it. My parents still decided to fight the will in court, hired a lawyer and everything. Months passed of hearings and paperwork, while I tried to get on with my life, go back to university, focus on my classes. Tyler moved closer to where I was so he could be with me more often, and that helped a lot. My grandma was a rock, never complained about the stress of the whole legal process, just told me that my grandpa had been very smart and to trust him. The judge finally dismissed my parents' case, said the will was completely legal and that my grandpa had every right to distribute his property however he wanted. But since my parents had formally initiated the inheritance claim in court, it activated the Florida property clause. Now they officially inherited that land with all its debt and had to start paying immediately or face more legal action. My dad tried to renounce the inheritance, but Edward explained it was too late, that at the moment they made the official claim they had accepted all the conditions of the will. The following months were like watching a ship slowly sink. My parents had to sell their house to cover part of the Florida debt. They moved to a smaller apartment. My dad had to take out loans. Nicole would text me occasionally, at first trying to convince me to give them some of my inheritance to help them, then just complaining about how everything was my fault for not being the bigger person and forgiving. I eventually blocked her because I couldn't deal with that manipulation on top of everything else. Like a year into all this drama, Nicole showed up at my grandma's house one afternoon. I'm there visiting for a weekend. I'd already moved back to live in an apartment near my university with Tyler, but I visited my grandma often. Nicole arrived crying, no makeup, wrinkled clothes. She looked destroyed. At first I thought she was coming to complain at me again, but what she said left me frozen. Matthew had been cheating on her, not just now, but throughout their entire marriage, and she had found conversations on his phone with several women. The worst part was when Nicole told me that one of the women saved in Matthew's phone had my name. My name. She had seen the old messages and realized that the messages I had supposedly sent Matthew, the ones that caused me to be kicked out of the house, were actually from his mistress, but he had saved her number under my name so Nicole wouldn't suspect. Nicole completely broke down right there in my grandma's living room, asking me for forgiveness over and over, saying she had been so stupid, that she should have believed me, that she had helped destroy my life for a man who had been betraying her the whole time. Part of me wanted to scream at her, tell her yes, she had been stupid, that she abandoned me when I needed her most. But another part just felt sorry because my sister had also been a victim of Matthew and his manipulation. I didn't forgive her immediately or anything, But I told her she could stay with my grandma a few days while she decided what to do, that she needed to get out of that house with Matthew. My parents found out about Matthew, and their reaction was typical of them. They kicked Matthew out of the house, where Nicole was still living with them since they'd had to sell their big house. And my dad had the audacity to call my grandma to apologize. Not to me, to my grandma. He told her he'd been a fool, that his father had been right all along, that he didn't deserve any of the inheritance after how he'd treated his own daughter. He sounded sincere, I guess, but it was hard to forget that he'd kicked me out on the street without listening to me, that he'd completely abandoned me for months. Nicole stayed with my grandma like 2 months, while she started her divorce process. Little by little, we rebuilt some kind of relationship. It wasn't like before, obviously, probably never would be, but at least we could talk without everything being pain and resentment. She'd tell me about the divorce, about how Matthew was trying to keep things that didn't belong to him, and I tried to support her even though everything that had happened still hurt. My grandma told Nicole that when she died, she was going to leave the house to Nicole in her will. Nicole at first said no, that I deserved that house after everything. But my grandma was firm, said I already had what my grandpa wanted me to have, and that Nicole needed a safe place to rebuild her life away from Matthew and the chaos of my parents. That seemed fair to me. Honestly, I didn't need the house, and Nicole did need stability. Now, I'm in my last year of university, living with Tyler in an apartment we pay for together even though I could pay for it alone with the inheritance. I use that money from Grandpa carefully, mainly for tuition and to save for the future. I don't want to waste it on stupid things. I see my grandma every 2 weeks or so. Sometimes Nicole is there and we have lunch together. We talk about normal things like the weather or Netflix series, avoiding the heavy topics. My parents and I talk like once every 2 months. Super superficial and awkward conversations where we all pretend we're working on rebuilding the relationship, but deep down we know there are things that can't be completely fixed. The other day, my grandma showed me an old photo of my grandpa. I think it was from when he was like 40 years old, working in his office surrounded by papers and calculators. She told me he always said that numbers don't lie, that the accounts always balance out in the end if you know how to read. Tell them. I guess that also applied to people and relationships. You know what I mean? In the end, everything balanced out. The truth came out. The liars faced consequences. And I ended up where my grandpa wanted me to be. Protected and with the opportunity to make my life without depending on people who had proven they didn't deserve my trust. I don't know if I'll ever completely forgive my parents, or if my relationship with Nicole will ever be like when we were kids. Probably not. But I'm in therapy now, working through all this, and I'm okay. I have Tyler, I have my career, I have a future I can build, thanks to my grandpa who saw me when nobody else did. Sometimes I think about how things would have been if he hadn't changed that will, if he'd left everything distributed equally, like is traditional, and it gives me chills to think I'd probably still be fighting to prove my innocence. While my parents enjoyed an inheritance they didn't deserve, my grandpa knew exactly what he was doing. He set everything up like an accountant, balancing the books perfectly, and he left me not just money, but the truth carved into legal documents that nobody could argue with. That's more valuable than any amount of money, I think.